They opened the sealed door of Karl XII's private chamber, and the smell hit them first, iron and decay, thick and unrelenting, as if centuries of forgotten death had pooled in the air. Tiny bones clicked against cold metal on their own, forming a rhythm that seemed alive, measuring their fear, their pulse, their very presence. Shadows stretched unnaturally across walls, twisting toward the living, and for a moment, they realized the room had waited all this time for someone to listen, someone to join its symphony. Some attendants vanished that day, and no one ever heard them again. In the dead of January, 1718, Stockholm lay beneath a brittle sheet of frost that crackled under the steps of those few who still ventured into the streets before dawn. But the palace at the heart of the city throbbed with a warmth that felt alive, unnatural, as if the stone walls themselves had inhaled the cold outside and exhaled a strange, viscous heat. Inside, the royal chambers were sealed against wind and winter alike, yet the air inside vibrated with a tension that made the hairs along the servants' necks rise and tremble. No one could say precisely when it began, this chorus of noise, but the sound had become a presence, thick and deliberate, echoing off carved panels and gilded moldings. Tiny bones struck against cold metal with a rhythm that suggested purpose rather than accident, a staccato whisper that tickled the ears of any who dared linger in the corridors. The clatter slid through the hallways like liquid, pooling under doors, wrapping itself around the corners of tapestries, curling into the seams of floorboards. It had the quality of life, though life was absent, and the servants swore that sometimes the sound paused only to listen, only to assess who was brave enough to continue breathing in the same space. Karl XII had withdrawn into this chamber weeks prior, cutting himself from sunlight and candlelight alike, sealing the door with locks so numerous that even the attendants hesitated to approach. Yet beneath it, a scent seeped, subtle at first, a metallic tang that burned at the nostrils and coated the back of the throat, as if the air itself had absorbed the essence of something forbidden, something that had been alive and was no longer. It clung to the tapestries depicting victories and hunts, soaked into the cracks of the parquet floor, and settled into the lungs of the servants in thin, unrelenting waves, making each breath taste of rust and old blood. Some said the odor shifted over hours, beginning faintly like iron shavings, then deepening into the scent of soil turned over, of corpses left too long in crypts, of skin that had been removed and pressed against the cold. The intensity of the smell caused shivers that were not from the frost outside. It made the attendants' knees weak, their stomachs twist with anticipation and dread, a knowing that they could not place. In the chamber, Karl moved with the precision of a man constructing something sacred, yet horrifying, his fingers arranging fragments of bone into mechanical frameworks that clicked and tapped, as if each joint were learning its role, rehearsing for a performance that would outlast its creator. The patterns were impossible to follow, intricate in ways that defied comprehension, each mechanism linked to another by silver wire, thin as hair, taut with tension, carrying subtle vibrations through the air. The servants could hear it in their dreams, the tiny strikes of bone against metal, the rasp of joints sliding together, a sound that seemed to measure not only the chamber but themselves. No light fell on the king, yet shadows clung to him, stretching unnaturally across walls and floors, flickering with a rhythm that belonged to the room rather than to the fire. Every night, those who lingered near the threshold felt the temperature shift, the heat rising in waves like a living pulse, and the clatter growing louder, more insistent, until they could no longer distinguish whether it was the bones moving or their own hearts hammering in terror. The chamber had become a body of its own, breathing in measured inhalations, exhaling the smell of iron and decay, and Karl XII existed at its center, a conductor not of music, but of something older, something that demanded attention and obedience, and those who heard it knew they would never again walk through those halls unmarked by its presence. Night after night, in the month of January, 1718, the chamber of Karl XII refused to remain silent, and the stillness of the palace beyond seemed to press against the thick walls, as if the stones themselves feared to inhale the sounds that pulsed from within. The king's isolation was absolute, his doors bolted and layered with locks that carried the authority of finality. Yet inside, a rhythm had taken hold that no mortal hand could have produced alone. It began as a slow grinding, a rasping metallic whine that climbed through the rafters and settled like a living thing beneath the heavy tapestries. Servants pressed their ears to doors and heard the delicate snap of joints far too small to belong to any creature known to the natural world, a clicking and sliding that suggested motion, intent, and perhaps even thought. The noises grew in complexity with each passing night, layering over themselves, overlapping in patterns that made comprehension impossible, yet impossible to ignore. Shadows, long and quivering, pooled along the edges of the walls, moving with a strange autonomy, twisting and bending like smoke that had learned to remember the forms of the dead. Some nights, the attendants swore they glimpsed figures crouched near the corners of the room, impossibly thin and pale, limbs elongated, watching the door without ever crossing the threshold. They could not reconcile whether the eyes were real or only the effect of candlelight caught on the uneven surfaces of floor and wall. Exhaustion began to fuse with terror as the nights stretched longer, measured not in hours but in the persistence of sound, and by the seventh evening, the palace itself seemed to convulse with the intensity of the hidden symphony. The servants' knees gave way under the weight of expectation. Their stomachs churned at the anticipation of the next snap, the next rasp, as if the room held them hostage in a ritual they had neither consented to nor understood. Each noise was deliberate, precise, as though Karl were conducting, his fingers unseen yet orchestrating every bone and hinge, every minute rod and pin, into a crescendo that none were permitted to hear in fullness without shivering in helpless comprehension. The air thickened in waves, carrying the scent of iron and something far older, musk of decay pressed into the pores of walls and tapestries, clinging to garments, inhaled with every shallow breath until the servants could taste it on their tongues and feel it settle in their lungs like dust of the graves. Candles flickered despite the absence of draught, their flames bending as if recoiling from the rhythm, casting shadows that writhed across carved moldings and ornate panels, creating illusions of movement that blurred with reality until the boundaries of perception seemed to unravel. Footsteps in the corridors beyond slowed, hesitant, as if those who walked there feared to disturb the delicate architecture of sound emerging from the black chamber, and the air in the palace quivered, a silent witness to the force within, both mechanical and alive. Servants reported sweating in cold rooms, tremors in hands and knees, and a sensation of measured observation, as though the bones themselves could gauge their fear and find it wanting. Each night, the clattering and grinding gathered into brief crescendos, moments of impossible coordination where every joint snapped in sequence, every metallic rod struck in tandem, producing an effect that was not music but the suggestion of a language older than memory, a communication whose meaning was encoded in dread rather than intellect. Some swore the sound pulsed into their dreams, carrying through sleep like a tidal rhythm, leaving them waking with limbs heavy, hearts racing, minds frayed at the edges. Shadows deepened and multiplied with each hour, congealing at the threshold of the room, crawling along the floorboards, climbing the walls, a subtle extension of the mechanisms inside, a skeletal fog that measured its observers. When attendants attempted to flee, they found their movements slowed, their bodies resisting, as though the house itself had taken on weight, or as though unseen forces held them near, compelling them to witness, to endure, to mark time by the rhythm of bones striking metal. The king remained unseen, yet his presence pervaded every vibration, every subtle pulse, as if he had folded himself into the lattice of machinery and shadow, animating the chamber with a will that was at once patient and insistent. The clattering did not waver for hunger or exhaustion. It responded to nothing outside itself, existing with a persistence that made the walls quiver, the air thicken, the very floor hum with an energy that could not be measured by candles or clocks. Over the course of a week, the servants began to forget ordinary sounds, the click of a door, the tap of a horse's hoof in the courtyard, the sigh of wind against frozen panes. Only the chamber existed. Only the metallic rasp, the snap of miniature joints, the grinding of bone on metal, and the shadows that seemed to remember what was no longer alive. Some tried to leave, abandoning service, fleeing into the snow-cloaked streets, but even outside the palace, the memory of the rhythm haunted their steps, echoing in silence, twisting perception until it became impossible to distinguish wind from mechanism, shadow from substance. By the seventh night, exhaustion had curdled into terror so complete that the air outside the black chamber seemed thin and inadequate, a pale imitation of the density within. Those who remained spoke of inevitability, a weight pressing through stone, wood, and muscle alike, a certainty that whatever Karl had built was alive, and that it had begun its work long before any of them had arrived, and would continue long after they had gone. And still, in the center of it all, unseen, the king moved with deliberate precision, his fingers arranging and testing, adjusting the delicate lattice of bones and metal, conducting a symphony of dread, each snap and rasp a note in a score that no ear was meant to comprehend, yet every heart was forced to obey. Inside the chamber, the mechanisms multiplied and grew more intricate with every passing hour, as if the walls themselves had begun to encourage their expansion, pressing outward with a presence that was both silent and insistent. The frames of human bones, small and brittle, yet meticulously polished to a sheen that caught candlelight in strange, gleaming arcs, were bound with silver hinges and fine wire, the metal twisting and snapping under tension so subtle that it seemed alive. Each joint was a miniature articulation, a precision of motion that made the constructs bend in impossible ways, curving under invisible pressures, folding and unfolding with a rhythm that suggested thought, anticipation, and will. The latticework sprawled across the chamber like a city of the dead, tiny limbs interlocking with rods and pins, forming towers, bridges, and sprawling webs that shifted ever so slightly as though breathing, the faint click and rasp of connections whispering secrets to one another that the living could not understand. The king's obsession was no longer a secret, though no one dared speak of it aloud. The servants noticed his absence not as a retreat, but as an extension of the machinery itself. His hands, once nimble but human, now trembled with the same cadence as the snapping, grinding constructs, his fingers curling in anticipation of movements that had yet to happen, curling and uncurling as if he were testing the balance of forces within the lattice. Each breath he drew was measured to match the resonance of metal on bone. His pulse had slowed, aligning with the rhythm of the clattering, the rasping, the tiny snapping articulations that filled the chamber. The temperature shifted without explanation, warmth pooling near the machines in waves, circulating like a living current, while the air farther from the constructions remained thin and biting, making the skin crawl with unease. Shadows lengthened unnaturally in the flickering candlelight, pooling in corners and stretching across walls, but they did not simply mimic form. They seemed to anticipate the movement of the machinery, curling and twisting in advance of each click, sliding along floorboards with an intelligence that made the servants avert their gaze. A faint smell lingered, iron and dust, old flesh pressed into the grain of wood and stone, a stench that was not quite alive, but had been infused with something of life, a residue of vitality extracted and repurposed into the lattice of bones. Servants who lingered even at a distance reported nausea, dizziness, and a creeping sense that the room was measuring them, calculating the proportion of fear and attention they brought to the chamber, weighing it against the precision of the mechanisms within. Karl moved among them like a conductor invisible to the eye, a ghost of intent whose body had adapted to the creations he commanded. His spine stiffened in perfect alignment with the tallest arches of bone. His shoulders rotated subtly in anticipation of the snap of a joint somewhere beyond sight, his hands tracing arcs through air already resonant with the sound of metal and sinew. At times, the constructs moved as if guided by something larger, a force that seemed to emerge from the king and yet existed independently, each segment twisting and clicking with subtle autonomy while remaining tethered to the lattice as a whole. The servants swore that they could hear the beat of his heart in the hollow taps of the tiny bones, the scrape of wire against polished joints, and the faintest hum that resonated through the stone floorboards. Candles flickered in response to the movement, flames bending not from draft, but from some hidden energy radiating outward, shadows following the smallest gestures of the machinery, stretching and twisting in forms that no human mind could fully catalog. Karl's breathing had slowed to a rhythm so precise that it became impossible to discern whether the room's pulse dictated his or his dictated the room, a question the attendants dared not answer. Nights became longer, measured not by hours but by the accumulation of clicks, rasps, and snaps that now filled the palace corridors with a persistent vibration, a subtle trembling that extended beyond the chamber, into floors, walls, and beams, leaving those who walked above it feeling unsteady, unmoored. The king no longer needed to observe each joint. His body had learned the language of the constructs, each finger curl or wrist rotation producing corresponding motion, each inhalation a signal, each exhalation a command. Shadows of his own form interlaced with the lattice, a ghostly extension of flesh bound to bone, and the room pulsed in acknowledgement, the mechanical heartbeat mirrored in living muscle. The air thickened further, carrying the mingled odor of iron, dust, and the faint, unplaceable musk of bones long dead, so that breathing became a deliberate act, each inhalation drawing in part of the chamber itself. Servants who entered stumbled in their footsteps, knees shaking, eyes watering, hearts racing not solely from fear, but from a perception that the very room was alive, that it was aware, and that it measured each presence with scrutiny and appetite. By the end of the week, even the smallest shifts in the lattice were noted by those on the periphery. A rod that had twisted imperceptibly overnight, a joint that snapped slightly sooner than it had the day before, a miniature frame that now leaned into another as though seeking balance, all signaling a growth that could not be catalogued, controlled, or ignored. And through it all, Karl remained at the center, his body no longer merely human, his pulse and breath fused with the instruments, his fingers tracing rhythms that had no name, commanding a symphony of bone and metal that measured, memorized, and consumed in equal measure, an order beyond understanding, a presence that required neither observation nor approval, existing instead as the fulcrum of something vast, terrifying, and entirely alive. When Karl finally died, in the bleak hours of January 1718, his body did not surrender to the collapse of mortal flesh. It remained upright, seated with unnatural poise before the lattice of bones and silver, his hands resting on the arms of a chair carved for a man, yet too small and delicate for what it now held. The eyes, glassy yet fixed, seemed to observe not the room, but something deeper, something beyond the reach of human comprehension, as though the king had only stepped aside and allowed the mechanisms to take their full measure of life and presence. The air inside the chamber was thick, viscous with a scent that combined iron, dust, and the faint musk of decay pressed into eternity, and it clung to walls and floorboards with a persistence that forced the attendants to inhale it despite every instinct to turn away. Servants who dared cross the threshold found their feet trembling, their knees buckling as the latticework shivered, each joint and rod vibrating in an imperceptible cadence that reached beneath the skin, tugging at marrow, memory, and reason alike. The tones it produced were not music. They were something darker, a resonance that seemed to measure the space and weight of fear, counting heartbeats, tallying breaths, and recording presence with a precision that was impossible to escape. Shadows pooled thickly in the corners of the room, curling toward the lattice, intertwining with rods of bone and wire as though eager to merge, to become part of the structure that had grown from obsession into something autonomous, something alive. Candlelight danced in response, flames bending and twisting without wind, stretching shadows into forms that reminded attendants of bodies they had known, of children lost to winter, of soldiers who had fallen in wars the city had almost forgotten. Madness arrived slowly at first, creeping along the spine, tightening the chest, whispering that the sounds were not external but embedded in the listener, a dissonant chord that could be felt as well as heard, tugging at memory and reason with the persistence of tide against cliffs. Some servants fell to their knees, gripping floorboards as the tiny mechanisms clicked and rasped in perfect synchrony, the lattice pulsing with a rhythm that seemed drawn from the heart of the dead king himself. Breathing became deliberate, shallow, inadequate, as though inhalation might provoke the lattice to notice, to respond, to measure and record. One by one, they recognized the futility of avoidance. The chamber had claimed attention, presence, and thought, and it would not release them willingly. The body of Karl, seated as though conducting an invisible symphony, appeared neither decomposed nor alive, but in a state between, a vessel of authority pressed into permanence by obsession and mechanism. Each finger, curled or resting, seemed to transmit a subtle force, a whisper of intent that caused the bones around it to vibrate, to articulate, to produce tones that resonated in the chest and head, bypassing the ears entirely. The servants, some who had served decades and understood fear in its familiar forms, could not name the sensation that gripped them. It was as though the chamber itself had developed cognition, a patience that measured them and found them wanting, a patience older than the frost that draped the city outside. Eyes darted to rods and pins that seemed to twitch independently, each movement sending a chain reaction across the lattice, producing harmonic disturbances that vibrated through floor, wall, and ceiling alike. The tiniest joint snapped with an audible pop, yet it was never abrupt, always calculated, a punctuation in a sentence written in bone and wire that the attendants could feel in the marrow of their own limbs. The shadows themselves appeared to pulse with the rhythm, curling toward observers, stretching fingers of darkness along spines, seeking warmth or life, or perhaps only acknowledgement. Whispers of the past seemed carried on the vibration, echoes of footsteps, laughter, cries from battlefields, the sighs of courtiers long gone, blending with the sound of snapping and grinding into a chorus that no human mind could endure without fracturing. The air thickened, hanging heavy in lungs, pressing on chests, forcing attention into the lattice, demanding it, and those who tried to leave found the threshold resisted them, the doors seeming to lean inward, as if the walls themselves sought to prevent departure. Some servants tried to cover ears, to flee into corridors, but the vibrations seeped into bone, into sinew, into thought, bypassing flesh entirely, and each dissonant chord pulled memory out of sequence, tangling recollection and terror into a single, inescapable sensation. The chamber had become a singular organism, its heart and pulse the latticework of bones and wire, its mind the obsession of Karl folded into pattern and rhythm, and all who witnessed it felt the inevitability of participation, a compulsion that did not require acknowledgement. Nights stretched without end, measured only by the cadence of clicking, rasping, snapping, a continuous dialogue between the mechanisms and the body of their creator, between the dead king and the living chamber. And yet, through it all, Karl remained upright, fixed in a presence that was more than memory and less than life, eyes glassy, hands poised, a conductor whose orchestra could exist without a visible hand, whose notes penetrated flesh, sinew, and reason, leaving madness trailing in its wake, leaving fear folded into the walls, and leaving all who entered certain that the chamber had claimed more than space. It had claimed them, in ways that would not be undone for as long as the cold city of Stockholm remembered frost and shadow. The chamber had transformed into a trap of sensation, a place where perception itself became distorted and unreliable, and where the hours of night stretched into unbroken eternities. In the month of January, 1718, the walls seemed to pulse with the activity of the skeletal mechanisms, each tiny joint twitching with deliberate purpose, each rod and hinge bending and snapping under invisible pressure that no human hand could guide. Every movement produced a note, a resonance not of music but of unease, a vibration that crept along floorboards and up through ceilings, extending into corridors beyond, so that the palace itself seemed to tremble with quiet horror. Servants walking these halls felt the rhythm in their bones, a persistent murmur that made limbs quiver and stomachs tighten, as though the house had learned to measure fear and found it wanting. Those who lingered too long began to vanish. No one saw the disappearances happen. They were noted only when a bed remained cold, a boot untouched, a candle left burning beyond its hour, and the echoes of their steps continued for days afterward, trapped in the corridors, a haunting accompaniment to the ceaseless snapping and grinding. Whispers of their absence circulated silently among the remaining attendants, carried not by voice but by the tension in the air, a pressure that urged observation without allowing understanding, as if the walls themselves had begun to record every heartbeat and assign value to it. Nights grew oppressive, each longer than the last, measured not by the moon or candlelight, but by the cadence of bones clicking against metal, the rasp of wires sliding over polished surfaces, and the soft grinding of miniature hinges whose purpose was inscrutable. Floors vibrated beneath bare feet, subtle at first, then growing stronger, humming with the resonance of the constructs, the sensation both physical and mental, as though the lattice of mechanisms had extended its perception beyond its own borders. Doors refused to remain closed, swinging open with the faintest provocation, or latching shut against the will of those who approached, and the attendants dared not test them for fear of awakening something worse, something patient and aware. Shadows pooled in corners and along walls, deepening in response to the movement of the constructs, stretching toward watchers like fingers seeking warmth, yet always retreating before they could be touched, leaving only the memory of pressure and presence. The scent of iron and decay thickened, pressing into clothing and hair, a reminder that the room was not simply a space but a living force, composed of bone, wire, and the lingering will of Karl XII. Servants reported nausea and tremors, but more troubling was the sensation of being observed, not by eyes but by a consciousness embedded in the lattice itself, a silent hunger that measured thought and intention, weighing presence against absence and finding the living inadequate. Floors shifted subtly beneath weight, as if the chamber had grown aware of balance, sending ripples through stone and wood that left feet unsure of purchase, bodies hesitant, hearts racing with a sense that failure to obey the rhythm would be met with consequences yet unseen. Time itself seemed altered, the boundary between night and day dissolving into a continuum of sound, shadow, and vibration, where hours were counted by the clicks of tiny joints and the rasping of wire against bone. Those who survived long enough to speak of it described corridors alive with the resonance of the mechanisms, hallways vibrating with tones that had no name, that seemed to echo the pulse of the dead king's obsession and embedded in the perception of all who walked them. Even memory became unreliable. Attendants recalled events they could not reconcile with reality, glimpsed forms in candlelight that vanished when approached, heard footsteps and voices that had no source, felt the pressure of invisible hands along their backs, and could not separate imagination from the persistent truths of the chamber. Some attempted to flee, rushing through corridors, but the vibrations followed them, humming in floorboards, rising through their bones, a constant reminder that the lattice measured everything, recorded everything, and claimed more than just attention. Madness spread quietly, imperceptibly at first, then with terrifying certainty, a creeping distortion of thought, of awareness, of the very sense of self. Servants who remained spoke of being unable to breathe without hearing the dissonant tones of the mechanisms, of walls that seemed to lean in, floors that pressed upward, shadows that crawled in anticipation of notice. The skeletal lattice had grown beyond mere construction. It had become predator and judge, a sentient presence forged from the obsession of Karl and the vitality of the dead, and it demanded participation in its rhythm. Those who survived learned to move with extreme care, coordinating breath, steps, and glance to avoid provoking the attention of the constructs, though whether such care had any effect was impossible to determine. The lattice pulsed as if alive, its heartbeat measured not by any human instrument, but by the compulsion it enforced upon those who remained, a pulse felt in marrow and sinew, in chest and skull, and in the mind itself, tugging at memory, reason, and fear. And all around, the shadows twisted and stretched, curling toward the mechanisms and retreating, a visual echo of the sound that resonated, binding the living to the rhythm of the dead, embedding them in a continuity of observation, measurement, and unending, insistent presence. The room was no longer a chamber but a force, a trap of sensation that exceeded space, a lattice of bone, wire, and obsession, alive with the intent to measure, to record, and to claim, leaving all who entered aware that survival meant obeying a rhythm beyond understanding, and that those who vanished were not lost. They had become part of it. Decades passed like frost over stone, and the memory of Karl XII and his obsessions had faded into rumor and cautionary tale, whispered among the servants of Stockholm, but never acknowledged by the crown. In the spring of 1750, the palace undertook renovations, sweeping away centuries of dust, soot, and neglect, revealing corridors and chambers that had been sealed and forgotten. Beneath layers of plaster and timber, the Black Room waited, untouched yet alive with a silent patience that had endured decades without the warmth of human proximity. The door, once thick and painted with the insignia of royal authority, groaned as it opened, the hinges rusted but still capable of a subtle, deliberate movement, and immediately the air inside struck those who entered with the scent of iron and decay, a presence so insistent that it pressed upon lungs, throat, and mind alike. Rust had claimed the machines superficially, yet their structure remained perfect, joints frozen in positions that hinted at movement paused mid-thought, rods of bone and wire woven into a lattice that suggested not construction but life, a skeletal organism that had grown beyond the hand of its maker. Visitors who stepped across the threshold were seized by a sensation that was at once physical and spiritual, a vibration that seemed to pulse from the floorboards through spine and rib, carrying the resonance of the small, grinding mechanisms as if they had waited only for fresh blood and presence to reawaken their song. The notes themselves were not audible in the ordinary sense, yet they invaded perception, pressing into marrow and muscle, threading into thoughts, tugging memory into sequences that made the rational mind recoil. Some attendants, already wary from tales inherited over decades, trembled and recoiled, but the lattice ignored hesitation. It had grown patient and meticulous, understanding that fear was part of its design, a seasoning to strengthen the effect of its resonance. As the days progressed, those who lingered in the chamber reported changes they could not explain, subtle shifts in gait, posture, and breath, a compulsion to move in harmony with the ticking, clicking, and rasping that the machines produced without human touch. It was as though the Black Room had learned to operate independently, the mechanisms self-sustaining, the soundscape complete, yet incomplete without a body to absorb it, to register it, to participate. The lattice seemed to call out in silent vibration, drawing from those who entered an unwilling acknowledgement, a tacit contract to merge with the structure of obsession that had outlived its maker. Hands that touched rods of bone reported an electric resistance, a tingling that traveled up the arms and into the chest, and some felt it reach the heart itself, as though the rhythm had measured their pulse and adjusted its own accordingly. Fear became secondary to a compulsion that could not be denied, knees bent, breath synchronized, muscles responding without thought, the body compelled to obey the silent cadence of a mechanism that had evolved into predator and chorus, judge and arbiter. Those who remained long enough found themselves subtly changed. A wrist, a finger, or a rib seemed to resonate with the machinery, each vibration reinforcing the lattice's grip, embedding presence into structure, tracing lines of life into bone and wire. Some attendants vanished entirely, leaving only echoes and memories, the absence recorded in the rhythm of snapping joints and tiny metallic rasping, a testimony to the chamber's patience and power. The palace administration, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge the truth, left the room sealed once more, removing keys and issuing orders that no further exploration should occur. Yet the air of the Black Room persisted beyond its walls, seeping through cracks and grates, carrying with it a faint iron tang that lingered in hallways, chambers, and courtyards for weeks afterward, an invisible reminder that the lattice had endured. Sometimes, when the wind carried from the northeast over the frozen city, a faint metallic melody drifted from the walls, a harmony of snapping joints and wire rasping, threading through the stone and mortar into the streets, brushing past those who had thought themselves untouched by history, claiming them silently, inexorably, as if the past had been preserved not only in story but in substance. Those who heard it felt an urge to follow the sound, to step closer, to become part of the rhythm that existed without consent, and some, in their fascination or terror, did exactly that, their own bones subtly drawn into the lattice, pulse merging with the beat of the mechanisms, consciousness absorbed into a composition older than memory, more persistent than death. The Black Room had endured because it had learned patience, because it had transformed obsession into organism, because it required more than attention. It required participation, and participation had a price measured in the body itself. By the end of the month, rumors swirled among the palace staff of attendants who had entered and never returned, of rooms that hummed faintly even when sealed, and of a metallic melody that drifted unpredictably through the air, insistent and irresistible. The city, for weeks afterward, carried the scent of iron and ancient decay, a subtle reminder that time had not erased Karl XII's work, that the Black Room existed beyond oversight, beyond authority, beyond the ordinary reckoning of life and death. And when the wind was right, when candles flickered and shadows pooled just so, anyone who lingered near the sealed walls could hear it, a harmony of snapping bone, rasping wire, and the heartbeat of obsession itself, claiming, inexorably, all who believed they had survived history, folding them into a rhythm that had waited decades to reclaim what it had measured and marked, a melody eternal, unyielding, and hungry.